The overseer's whip cracked across tobacco leaves, still heavy with morning dew, but Kofi never flinched. His lips moved in patterns that sounded like wind through unfamiliar trees, words that made the other enslaved workers glance nervously at each other across the Virginia plantation rows. This is the story of how a language no white man understood became the catalyst for one of the bloodiest slave uprisings in colonial America. The Hartwell Plantation sprawled across 1,500 acres of prime Virginia soil in 1793, where the James River curved like a serpent spine through Henrico County. The sound of rushing water mixed with the constant crack of leather, while the air carried the sweet, sick smell of curing tobacco and something else, fear, thick as the humidity that clung to everything like a second skin. Rough-hewn wooden quarters lined the dirt path leading from the main house, their walls worn smooth by countless hands seeking balance in the dark. Kofi had arrived on a ship from Charleston 3 months earlier, purchased at auction for $400 by plantation owner Edmund Hartwell. Unlike the other enslaved Africans who'd been born in America or had spent years learning broken English, Kofi spoke in a tongue that defied identification. The other workers whispered that his words sounded like nothing they'd heard. Not Yoruba, not Igbo, not any of the languages their grandparents remembered from across the water. From the Plantation Ledger, July 15, 1793. New acquisition, Kofi, approximately 25 years. Strong build, peculiar speech patterns. Previous owner claimed linguistic abilities unusual. Price justified by physical condition. But Edmund Hartwell hadn't bought Kofi for his linguistic mysteries. The man could work 20 hours in the tobacco fields without complaint, could repair broken tools with hands that moved like they remembered different trades, and most importantly, never showed the defiance that marked troublemakers. At least, not in ways white eyes could recognize. The other enslaved people began gathering around Kofi during the brief moments between work and exhaustion. Not for conversation, he rarely spoke English beyond the bare necessities, but to listen. His voice carried rhythms that seemed to unlock something in their chests, syllables that made muscles remember they'd once belonged to people with names instead of prices. Sarah, the head cook, noticed it first. "That man's words," she whispered to her daughter Mercy, "they make my soul feel like it's trying to remember something." What none of them understood yet was that Kofi's language wasn't just communication, it was preparation. The rebellion brewing in the tobacco fields of Virginia had been 3 months in the making, disguised as prayer, hidden in work songs, coded in conversations that sounded like nothing more than the mundane exchanges of people resigned to bondage. But resignation, like slavery itself, was a performance that required perfect timing. Every evening, as the sun painted the sky the color of dried blood, Kofi's voice would rise just slightly above the others during what the overseers assumed were spiritual songs. His words wove through familiar melodies, adding layers that transformed hymns of submission into something else entirely, something that made hearts beat faster and hands clench into fists before deliberately relaxing. The first sign that something fundamental had shifted came when Jake, a blacksmith who'd been broken by 15 years of bondage, began standing straighter. Then came Ruth, who'd lost 3 children to the auction block, suddenly meeting the overseer's eyes instead of staring at the ground. Small changes, barely perceptible, but patterns that suggested the impossible. How does a language become a weapon when the speakers have no guns, no legal rights, no apparent power beyond their capacity to endure? The answer lay in words that carried more than meaning. They carried memory, strategy, and something far more dangerous to a system built on dehumanization. They carried hope, but on the night of August 18th, 1793, Kofi's whispered syllables would transform into something else entirely, and the Virginia countryside would learn that some languages are written in blood. Before we continue deeper into this story, I want to know where you're watching from right now. What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in courthouse records for over 2 centuries. The morning of August 1st, 1793, Overseer Thomas Mitchell found something that made his blood run cold. Scratched into the dirt floor of the tobacco barn were symbols that looked like no alphabet he'd ever seen. Circles intersected with lines, patterns that seemed to move in his peripheral vision like living things. This discovery would force the plantation's white inhabitants to confront a terrifying possibility. Their slaves weren't just planning to run away. The symbols appeared overnight in places where Kofi had been working, carved into wooden posts with fingernails, traced in ash on cabin walls, even pressed into the soft clay near the well where the enslaved workers drew water each dawn. The marks seemed random to untrained eyes, but they followed Kofi's daily path through the plantation with mathematical precision. From the tobacco fields to the blacksmith shop, from the quarters to the main house kitchen, a map written in a language that predated European arrival on the continent. Mitchell brought the symbols to Edmund Hartwell, who studied them with the focused attention of a man who'd built his wealth on understanding every detail of his property. The planter had seen African script before some of his earlier acquisitions had carried tribal markings or ritual scars, but these symbols held a different quality. They weren't decorative or spiritual, they were functional. From a letter dated August 2nd, 1793, Edmund Hartwell to his brother in Richmond. The new Negro continues his peculiar behavior. Found markings that suggest coordination among the others. Recommend increased vigilance. But vigilance required understanding what to watch for, and the white inhabitants of Hartwell Plantation were blind to the revolution taking shape around them. They saw Kofi teaching other enslaved people to repair harnesses and assumed he was sharing practical skills. They heard him leading work songs and dismissed it as the natural rhythm of field labor. They noticed increased conversation during meal breaks and attributed it to the social nature of people adjusting to a new addition to their community. What they couldn't see was the curriculum hidden within each interaction. Sarah's daughter, Mercy, later described those August days as feeling like standing in a thunderstorm before the lightning comes. The air itself seemed charged with possibility, but also with danger that made survival instincts sharpen to razor points. Children who'd been taught to keep their voices low began speaking in whispers that carried farther than shouts. Adults who'd perfected the art of moving invisibly through white spaces suddenly moved with purpose that suggested destinations beyond the next work assignment. The language itself was the key to everything. Linguists would later theorize that Kofi spoke a Creole that blended multiple West African dialects with elements that suggested contact with indigenous American languages. But the enslaved people of Hartwell Plantation understood something the scholars would miss. This wasn't just communication between people who shared a common oppression. This was strategic coordination, disguised as cultural preservation. Jake the blacksmith found himself making more tools than usual that August, hoes that could serve other purposes. Horseshoes shaped slightly differently than standard patterns. Iron implements that looked agricultural but carried weight distributions suggesting different applications entirely. When Mitchell asked about the increased production, Jake simply said, "Mr. Kofi, he showed me better ways." Better ways to do what, exactly? The question haunted Mitchell's dreams, but he couldn't articulate his suspicions without sounding paranoid. After all, improved productivity was exactly what plantation owners wanted from their human property. The fact that the improvements came with an undercurrent of energy that made his skin crawl seemed like a personal problem rather than a legitimate concern. Ruth, who'd lost 3 children to auction, began volunteering for kitchen duties that brought her into the main house. She memorized the layout with the attention to detail that grief had taught her where the guns were stored, which rooms offered escape routes, how sound traveled through the building at different hours. Her new helpfulness earned praise from Hartwell's wife Margaret, who commented to neighbors about how the influence of the new African was civilizing her other slaves. Civilizing. The word carried weight that would prove prophetic. Words became weapons. By August 15th, the symbols had evolved into something more complex. Instead of simple marks, they formed intricate patterns that suggested not just communication, but calculation. Numbers hidden in geometric designs. Dates encoded in arrangements that looked like decorative flourishes. The most troubling discovery came when Mitchell realized the symbols appeared in sequences, not random placement, but deliberate progression that suggested countdown. Countdown to what? The answer lay in Kofi's evening gatherings, which had grown from small clusters of listeners to organized assemblies that included nearly every enslaved person on the plantation. They still sang familiar spirituals, still maintained the appearance of religious observance that white authorities expected and tolerated. But the lyrics had changed in ways that created meaning beyond the original words. Wade in the water became instructions for river crossings. Swing low, sweet chariot, transformed into timing sequences. Go down. Moses carried tactical information that Moses himself had never intended. The most chilling aspect wasn't the coordination itself, but the discipline. 43 enslaved people sharing secrets without a single leak to their masters. Children as young as 8 maintaining operational security that would have impressed military commanders. Adults who'd spent decades accepting their powerlessness, suddenly demonstrating organizational capabilities that suggested they'd never truly accepted anything at all. They'd simply been waiting for the right words to set their plans in motion. But on the night of August 18th, 1793, those words would finally be spoken aloud, and the Virginia countryside would discover that some languages are best understood through action rather than translation. Margaret Hartwell's teacup shattered against the parlor floor at 4:37 on the afternoon of August 17, 1793. The sound that had startled her wasn't thunder. It was 43 voices rising in perfect unison from the quarters, singing words she'd never heard before. The synchronized precision of that moment would haunt her surviving family members for generations, because it meant the rebellion had moved beyond planning into execution. The morning had begun like any other August day on the plantation. Roosters crowing at dawn, the smell of wood smoke rising from cooking fires, the rough texture of homespun fabric against skin as workers dressed in the pre-dawn darkness. But underneath these familiar rhythms, something fundamental had shifted. The enslaved people moved with the coordinated efficiency of an army preparing for battle, disguised as another day of agricultural labor. Kofi stood in the tobacco fields as the sun reached its zenith, his voice carrying across the rows in cadences that sounded like ancient prayers. But Ruth, working in the main house kitchen, understood every syllable. The words were instructions, final confirmations of positions, roles, timing. Each phrase corresponded to plans they'd rehearsed in secret for weeks, using the symbolic language that had evolved from simple markings into a complete tactical communication system. From the diary of Overseer Thomas Mitchell, August 17, 1793, the Negroes continue their singing today with unusual enthusiasm. Kofi leads them in their heathen tongue, but they work without complaint. Productivity remains high. Mitchell's blindness to what was happening around him exemplified the fatal flaw in the plantation system. White owners and overseers had convinced themselves that enslaved people were incapable of sophisticated planning, that their apparent docility reflected mental limitations rather than survival strategy. This assumption would cost them everything. Jake the blacksmith had spent the previous week creating tools that served dual purposes: agricultural implements that could become weapons with minimal modification, horseshoes that could be thrown with devastating accuracy, iron bars that looked like structural supports but were actually sized for human hands seeking leverage against locked doors. Every piece was distributed according to Kofi's specifications, hidden in locations that corresponded to the symbolic maps they'd memorized. The most sophisticated element of the preparation involved the main house itself. Ruth and two other women had been systematically mapping the building's vulnerabilities during their domestic duties. They knew which floorboards creaked, which windows opened silently, where the firearms were stored, and how they were secured. More importantly, they'd identified the location of important documents, deeds, bills of sale, correspondence with other plantation owners that would burn easily and thoroughly. Sarah's daughter Mercy had been assigned to the most dangerous task, monitoring the movements of the white family members. She'd learned their routines with the precision of someone whose life depended on predicting behavior. Edmund Hartwell retired to his study every evening at 8 o'clock. Margaret Hartwell checked on the children at 9:30. The overseers made their final rounds at 10:15 before settling into their quarters for the night. This intelligence had been gathered over months, disguised as the natural observations of domestic workers who needed to anticipate their master's needs. But the information served a different purpose entirely, identifying windows of opportunity when the plantation's power structure would be most vulnerable to coordinated assault. Blood would flow before dawn. The afternoon gathering that had startled Margaret Hartwell represented the final coordination meeting, 43 people standing in perfect formation, their voices creating harmonies that carried coded information across the plantation grounds. To white ears, it sounded like spiritual music with unfamiliar lyrics. To trained listeners, it was a military briefing conducted in plain sight. Kofi's role as coordinator became clear during this final assembly. His mysterious language wasn't just communication, it was command structure. Different tonal patterns indicated different tactical units. Rhythmic variations specified timing sequences. Melodic changes confirmed individual assignments and backup procedures. The rebellion had been organized with the precision of a military campaign, using cultural practices that white authorities dismissed as primitive entertainment. The most chilling aspect of the afternoon's display was the participation of the children. Boys and girls who'd spent their entire lives watching their parents submit to degradation suddenly stood with the posture of soldiers receiving final orders. They'd been trained in their roles gradually, taught to see the uprising not as violence, but as liberation. Their presence in the formation sent a clear message. This wasn't a desperate escape attempt. This was a revolution. As evening approached, the plantation settled into routines that had been carefully observed and cataloged. Cooking fires were banked for the night, livestock secured in their pens, tools cleaned and stored according to protocols that had been followed for decades. But tonight, those same tools would serve different purposes, and the people who'd appeared to submit to those routines were about to demonstrate that submission had always been performance. The final signal came as darkness fell across Henrico County. Kofi's voice rose one last time in the mysterious language that had puzzled white ears for months. But now the words carried unmistakable authority, not the pleading of the oppressed, but the commands of someone who'd never truly been conquered. What happens when 43 people who've been treated as property decide to reclaim their humanity simultaneously? The answer would be written in blood across the Virginia countryside before the sun rose again, and the name Kofi would be whispered in slave quarters across the South as both warning and inspiration for decades to come. The grandfather clock in Edmund Hartwell's study chimed 11 times as Kofi's voice rose through the darkness, no longer whispering, but commanding in syllables that cut through Virginia's humid air like blades through silk. This was the moment when 3 months of careful planning transformed into action that would reshape the balance of power across Henrico County forever. The first phase began with precision that would have impressed European military strategists. Ruth moved through the main house like a shadow with purpose, her bare feet finding every silent floorboard she'd memorized during months of domestic service. Behind her, 2 other women carried items that looked like cleaning supplies, but served different functions entirely. Rags soaked in lamp oil, matches wrapped in oiled cloth, documents that would burn hot and fast. The sound of splitting wood echoed across the plantation grounds as Jake's carefully crafted tools found their intended uses. Barn doors that had secured livestock now swung open to release horses that scattered into the Virginia countryside. Storage buildings that had held supplies suddenly yielded their contents to hands that knew exactly where everything was located. The systematic dismantling of the plantation's infrastructure happened with clockwork efficiency, each action timed to support the larger strategy. From a surviving fragment of correspondence found years later, the coordination suggested months of preparation, no random violence, but calculated dismantling of every system that maintained our authority. Margaret Hartwell woke to the smell of smoke, but not from the cooking fires that normally announced dawn. This smoke carried the acrid scent of burning documents, leather, and something else that made her stomach clench with primal fear. Through her bedroom window, she could see figures moving with purpose across the plantation grounds, not running in panic, but walking with the confident stride of people executing a plan. The rebellion's genius lay not in its violence, but in its systematic approach to liberation. Instead of simply attacking their oppressors, the enslaved people dismantled the entire economic and social structure that made oppression possible. Bills of sale burned in carefully controlled fires. Breeding records disappeared into flames that consumed decades of human commodification. Correspondence with other plantation owners vanished, along with the networks that facilitated the slave trade. Kofi stood in the center of the quarters, his voice carrying instructions that transformed his mysterious language into the common tongue of coordinated resistance. But the words he spoke weren't calls for revenge, they were logistics. Which roads led to safety? Which neighboring plantations offered sanctuary? Which supplies were essential for survival in the wilderness? The uprising had been planned not as a massacre, but as an exodus. The plantation's white inhabitants found themselves facing something they'd never imagined. Enslaved people who refused to remain enslaved, acting with the organizational capability of free citizens claiming their rights. Thomas Mitchell emerged from his quarters to find the world he'd known for 15 years, transformed beyond recognition. The stables stood empty, their doors hanging open, like mouths frozen in silent screams. The tobacco barns that had represented the plantation's wealth now served as gathering points for people preparing to leave everything they'd ever known. Most unsettling of all, the enslaved people who'd submitted to his authority for years now looked through him as if he'd become invisible. Some truths arrive with fire, but the most profound transformation occurred in the enslaved people themselves. Children who'd been taught to keep their eyes downcast now stood straight, watching the destruction of their prison with expressions that mixed satisfaction with determination. Adults who'd perfected the art of appearing broken suddenly revealed reserves of strength that had been hidden but never depleted. The rebellion wasn't creating new people, it was revealing who these people had always been beneath the performance of submission. Sarah's daughter Mercy later described the night as feeling like watching our real selves step out of shadows we'd been hiding in. The coordinated action revealed that the apparent powerlessness of the enslaved had been strategic deception. They'd possessed agency all along, simply waiting for the right moment to exercise it collectively. The systematic nature of the destruction sent a message that reached far beyond Hartwell Plantation. This wasn't random violence born of desperation. It was calculated revolution, executed by people who understood exactly how the system worked and precisely how to dismantle it. Every building that burned, every document that disappeared, every tool that vanished represented deliberate strikes against the infrastructure of human bondage. Edmund Hartwell barricaded himself in his study as smoke began seeping under the door, but the real danger wasn't the fire consuming his house. The real danger was the knowledge that 43 people he'd considered property had demonstrated capabilities that challenged every assumption upon which his world was built. How do you maintain a system of oppression when the oppressed reveal they were never truly powerless, only patient? The answer would reshape Virginia's approach to slavery forever. Because what happened at Hartwell Plantation wasn't an isolated incident, it was a demonstration of possibilities that existed on every plantation where people remembered languages their masters couldn't understand. By dawn on August 19, 1793, smoke columns rose from 3 separate plantations across Henrico County, and the word Kofi had become a whispered prayer of liberation that traveled faster than the mounted patrols sent to stop it. The success at Hartwell Plantation had unleashed something that Virginia's ruling class had never prepared for: the systematic collapse of their labor force. The morning air carried the acrid smell of burning records mixed with honeysuckle and fear, while hoofbeats thundered across dirt roads that had never seen such urgent traffic. The texture of power itself had changed overnight. What had seemed solid, as Virginia clay, now felt fragile, as morning mist dissolving under direct sunlight. County officials, who'd awakened to reports of isolated rebellion, found themselves confronting coordinated uprising that suggested months of communication between plantations they'd assumed were isolated from each other. Kofi and his followers had vanished into the wilderness, with the efficiency of people who'd planned their escape routes as carefully as their initial assault. But their departure left behind something more dangerous than physical destruction: proof that the enslaved possessed organizational capabilities that challenged every assumption about racial hierarchy upon which Virginia society was built. The Turner Plantation, 5 miles east of Hartwell, experienced its own transformation at precisely 3:45 a.m. Unlike the systematic dismantling that had characterized the Hartwell uprising, this rebellion focused on liberation rather than destruction. 67 enslaved people simply walked away, taking only essential supplies and leaving behind a single message carved into the main house door: "Freedom calls in every language." From the Richmond Enquirer, August 22, 1793. The coordination suggests extensive planning and communication networks previously unknown to authorities. Immediate action required to prevent further spread of insurrection. The most unsettling aspect of the spreading rebellion wasn't the violence. There had been remarkably little bloodshed, but the discipline. Enslaved people who'd appeared to accept their bondage suddenly revealed sophisticated understanding of geography, weather patterns, and survival techniques that suggested they'd been preparing for freedom far longer than their masters had realized. Children who'd seemed incapable of complex thought demonstrated knowledge of safe routes, friendly contacts, and resource management that impressed even their pursuers. Virginia's militia mobilized with the urgency of an army facing invasion, because that's exactly what they were confronting. Not external attack, but internal revolution by people who knew the territory better than their hunters, who could disappear into swamps and forests that white trackers avoided, who possessed networks of communication that had been invisible until activated. Sheriff William Crawford organized the largest manhunt in Virginia history, assembling tracking dogs, professional slave catchers, and militia units from 4 counties. But they were hunting people who'd had months to prepare hiding places, supply caches, and escape routes. More problematically, they were pursuing individuals who demonstrated strategic thinking that challenged fundamental assumptions about African intellectual capacity. The search parties found evidence of the fugitives everywhere and nowhere, campsites that had been abandoned with military precision, leaving behind just enough traces to confirm passage, but no indication of direction. Supply caches that had been emptied systematically, suggesting the escapees were following predetermined plans rather than improvising survival. Most frustratingly, witnesses who claimed to have seen nothing, despite clear evidence that large groups had passed through their areas recently. Language became weapons of war. The rebellion's impact extended far beyond the immediate participants. On plantations across Virginia, enslaved people who'd never heard Kofi's mysterious tongue began demonstrating new behaviors that suggested communication networks authorities hadn't suspected. Work songs that had seemed innocent suddenly carried undertones that made overseers nervous. Domestic workers who'd been trusted with household access began making subtle changes that indicated divided loyalties. Margaret Hartwell, now a refugee in her brother's Richmond home, provided testimony that revealed the depth of white blindness to enslaved resistance. "They seemed so docile," she told investigators. Kofi appeared grateful for his position. The others showed no signs of discontent. How could we have known they were planning revolution? Her question exposed the fatal flaw in Virginia's slave system, the assumption that apparent submission indicated genuine acceptance. The Hartwell Rebellion demonstrated that enslaved people had been performing compliance while maintaining their essential humanity and planning for freedom. The performance had been so convincing that their masters had mistaken strategic patience for intellectual limitation. The economic impact proved as devastating as the human cost. Insurance companies refused to cover slave property in Henrico County. Plantation values collapsed as potential buyers recognized the impossibility of maintaining profitable operations when the labor force possessed demonstrated capacity for organized resistance. The system that had generated enormous wealth through human bondage suddenly faced the possibility that the commodified humans might refuse to remain commodities. But the most profound change occurred in the slave quarters of plantations where rebellion hadn't yet erupted. Whispered conversations now carried new possibilities. Children who'd accepted their bondage as natural law began asking questions about alternatives. Adults who'd buried their dreams of freedom began excavating hope they'd thought was dead. What happens when the impossible becomes real? When people who'd been defined as property demonstrate their capacity for strategic planning and coordinated action? The answer would reshape the South's approach to human bondage. But first, Virginia's authorities had to reckon with the immediate crisis. 43 missing people who'd vanished into landscapes they knew better than their pursuers, carrying knowledge that threatened to inspire similar uprisings across the region. At 7:43 a.m. on August 23, 1793, bloodhounds discovered something that made their handlers' skin crawl. Symbols carved into tree bark that matched the mysterious markings found at Hartwell Plantation. But these were fresh, cut within hours. The realization that Kofi's followers were still communicating while being hunted meant Virginia faced something far more dangerous than a simple slave rebellion. They were tracking an organized resistance movement. The forest floor beneath their feet, squelched with morning dew, mixed with something that smelled like crushed herbs and desperation, while the rough bark of ancient oaks bore witness to a communication system that had evolved beyond plantation boundaries. Professional tracker Samuel Briggs ran his weathered fingers across the fresh carvings, feeling the deliberate precision of someone who'd had time to work carefully despite being pursued by armed men and trained dogs. The symbols had appeared along a trail that led toward the Great Dismal Swamp, that vast wilderness spanning the Virginia-North Carolina border where runaway slaves had been establishing communities for decades. But these weren't the desperate scratchings of people fleeing in panic. They were systematic markers that suggested the escapees were following a predetermined route, leaving information for others who knew how to read their coded language. Sheriff Crawford assembled his tracking team around the tree, studying the markings with the grim focus of men who'd begun to understand they were outmatched. The symbols weren't random. They followed patterns that indicated direction, timing, even warnings about patrol movements. Someone in Kofi's group possessed intelligence about the manhunt itself, information that could only come from sources inside the white community. From the Journal of Tracker Samuel Briggs, August 23, 1793. The markings suggest they know our movements better than we know theirs. Either they have assistance from whites, or their intelligence gathering surpasses anything I've encountered in 20 years of tracking runaways. The breakthrough came when Dr. James Morton, a linguistics professor from the College of William and Mary, examined the symbols and recognized elements that shouldn't exist in colonial Virginia. The markings contained geometric patterns that matched indigenous Cherokee writing systems, combined with shapes that suggested West African Adinkra symbols, overlaid with mathematical notations that indicated European influence. The mysterious language wasn't ancient African dialect. It was a sophisticated fusion designed for strategic communication. This discovery transformed the manhunt from a pursuit of fugitive slaves into a search for evidence of a broader conspiracy. If Kofi could blend multiple linguistic traditions into functional code, what other capabilities had the enslaved population been hiding? How many plantations harbored people with similar skills? How extensive were the communication networks that had made coordinated rebellion possible? The tracking teams pushed deeper into swampland that had swallowed previous expeditions, following a trail that led through terrain where conventional tracking methods failed. Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from cypress trees, while the air carried sounds that made horses skittish, and men reached for weapons that felt inadequate against enemies who knew this landscape intimately. But the fugitives had left behind more than symbols. They'd abandoned supplies in strategic locations, food caches that indicated long-term planning, tools arranged in ways that suggested specific meanings, even clothing positioned to convey information to followers who understood the code. The rebellion had anticipated pursuit and prepared for extended survival in environments their hunters feared to enter. Freedom writes its own rules. The most disturbing discovery came when Crawford's men found evidence of outside assistance. A hidden camp contained supplies that couldn't have been gathered by escaped slaves, quality firearms, medical provisions, maps that showed safe routes through territory beyond Virginia's borders. Someone with resources and knowledge was supporting the rebellion, turning what should have been a simple recapture operation into something that threatened the entire regional economy. Messenger riders departed for Richmond, carrying reports that would reach the governor's desk within hours. The Kofi Rebellion had revealed capabilities and connections that challenged fundamental assumptions about slave control. If enslaved people could coordinate across plantations, communicate in unbreakable codes, and secure assistance from free populations, then the entire system of human bondage faced an existential threat. The search intensified as autumn approached, but the fugitives seemed to vanish deeper into landscapes that had protected runaway communities for generations. Each day that passed without capture proved that people who'd been treated as property possessed survival skills that their former masters had never suspected. The rebellion had succeeded in ways its planners might not have anticipated, not just in escaping bondage, but in demonstrating that bondage itself was an artificial construct that could be dismantled by people who refused to accept its legitimacy. Margaret Hartwell received word in Richmond that her former cook Sarah had been spotted leading a group of children through forest paths that led toward freedom. The woman who'd prepared meals in submission for 15 years was now teaching survival skills to the next generation, passing on knowledge that would make their children harder to recapture and impossible to fully enslave. What happens when a system built on the assumption of intellectual inferiority confronts evidence of sophisticated strategic thinking? The answer would reshape Virginia's approach to human bondage forever. But first, authorities had to confront an even more disturbing possibility: that Kofi's mysterious language had been spreading to slave quarters across the South, and the Hartwell Rebellion was only the beginning of a transformation that would challenge slavery itself. The Virginia state capitol bells tolled at noon on September 15, 1793, as Governor Henry Lee signed legislation that would transform slavery throughout the South. Laws written in response to a rebellion that had vanished into legend but left consequences as permanent as scars. The Kofi uprising had forced Virginia's ruling class to confront a terrifying truth. Their entire economic system depended on people who possessed capabilities their masters had never imagined. The marble floors of the Capitol building echoed with urgent footsteps, while the smell of ink and sealing wax mixed with the acrid smoke from documents being burned in government fireplaces. Correspondence that revealed how close the colony had come to systemic collapse. The smooth texture of expensive paper bore witness to emergency sessions that had continued for weeks as legislators grappled with reports that challenged every assumption about racial hierarchy and social control. The new laws reflected panic disguised as policy. Enslaved people were now forbidden from gathering in groups larger than 3 without white supervision. Teaching any enslaved person to read or write became a felony punishable by imprisonment. Most significantly, plantation owners were required to report any evidence of linguistic abnormalities among their human property, a direct response to Kofi's mysterious language and its role in coordinating rebellion. But the legislative response revealed something more profound than fear. It demonstrated that Virginia's authorities finally understood they'd been governing people who'd never truly been conquered, only strategically patient. From the Virginia Gazette, September 20th, 1793. Recent events have demonstrated the necessity of increased vigilance regarding the education and assembly of our servile population. The coordination displayed suggests capabilities that require immediate containment. The manhunt for Kofi and his followers had officially ended in failure after 6 weeks of searching, but rumors continued circulating through slave quarters across the South. Whispered stories told of a community established deep in the Great Dismal Swamp, where escaped slaves lived according to laws they'd written themselves. These tales carry details too specific to be entirely fictional descriptions of agricultural techniques, governing structures, and defensive capabilities that suggested first-hand knowledge. Some plantation owners began selling their human property rather than risk similar uprisings. The slave markets in Richmond and Charleston experienced unprecedented activity as nervous masters liquidated investments that no longer seemed secure. But this economic disruption created new problems. Displaced and enslaved people carried stories of the Kofi Rebellion to new locations, spreading knowledge that authorities couldn't contain. The most profound impact occurred in the slave quarters themselves. Children who'd grown up accepting their bondage as natural law began asking questions their parents had never dared voice. Adults who'd buried dreams of freedom started teaching survival skills disguised as cultural traditions. The rebellion had planted seeds that would germinate for generations, growing into forms of resistance that would eventually challenge slavery itself. Sarah, the former Hartwell cook, had indeed been spotted leading children through forest paths, but the sightings stopped at the swamp's edge. Either she'd found sanctuary in that vast wilderness, or she'd become part of the landscape itself, transformed from property into legend, from cook into teacher of survival. Revolution echoes through generations. Dr. Morton's linguistic analysis had revealed something that kept Virginia's scholars awake at night. The symbols Kofi's followers used weren't just communication tools. They were evidence of intellectual synthesis that challenged scientific theories about African mental capacity. Someone had blended multiple writing systems into functional code, demonstrating cognitive capabilities that contradicted every justification for human bondage. The economic consequences rippled across the Atlantic. London investors received reports that described coordinated slave resistance as a systemic threat to colonial profitability. Insurance rates for human property increased dramatically. Some British merchants began questioning whether slavery could remain economically viable if enslaved people possessed demonstrated capacity for organized resistance. But perhaps the most significant change occurred in the hearts and minds of people who'd never met Kofi, but had heard his story. Enslaved communities across the South began developing their own coded languages, their own communication networks, their own strategies for coordinated resistance. The mysterious tongue that had puzzled white authorities for months had inspired a linguistic revolution that would shape African American culture for centuries. Thomas Jefferson, writing privately to a colleague, captured the existential crisis the rebellion had created. If they can plan with such sophistication, if they can coordinate across vast distances, If they possess intellectual capabilities, we have denied what does this mean for the foundations of our society. The question haunted Virginia's leadership because it demanded answers they weren't prepared to provide. The Kofi Rebellion had demonstrated that enslaved people weren't naturally submissive, they were strategically patient. They weren't intellectually inferior, they were selectively revealing their capabilities. They weren't isolated individuals, they were members of communities that transcended plantation boundaries. Winter approached with unusual tension in slave quarters across Virginia. Overseers reported increased surveillance among their charges, but also noted that work songs had acquired new complexities. Domestic workers seemed more observant of household routines. Children appeared to be learning skills that had no obvious agricultural application. What happens when a system built on assumed powerlessness confronts evidence of hidden strength? When people defined as property demonstrate they've never truly accepted that definition. The answer lay waiting in the Great Dismal Swamp, where 43 people had vanished into legend and where their mysterious language continued evolving into something that would challenge the very foundations of human bondage across the American South. 230 years later, in a dusty archive beneath the Virginia Historical Society, a graduate student named Maria Santos discovered a leather-bound journal that contained the final piece of a puzzle historians had been trying to solve since 1793. The pages she uncovered would prove that Kofi's mysterious language had never truly disappeared. It had evolved into something far more dangerous to the systems that tried to suppress it. The basement air carried the familiar smell of old paper and preservation chemicals, mixed with something else that made Maria's skin prickle, the scent of secrets that had been waiting centuries to be discovered. Her fingertips traced the brittle edges of documents that had survived wars, floods, and deliberate attempts at destruction, while fluorescent lights hummed overhead like electronic prayers for knowledge that powerful people had tried to bury. The journal belonged to Dr. James Morton, the linguistics professor who'd analyzed Kofi's symbols during the manhunt. His private notes revealed that the mysterious language hadn't been African at all. It was a constructed code that blended Cherokee, Yoruba, and mathematical notation into a system designed specifically for coordinated resistance. But more significantly, Morton had discovered that similar linguistic innovations were appearing on plantations across the South. From Dr. Morton's private journal, dated December 10, 1793, the implications terrify me. If enslaved populations can create sophisticated communication systems in a matter of months, what other capabilities remain hidden? We may be governing people far more dangerous than we ever imagined. The rebellion's true genius hadn't been in its immediate success, but in its demonstration of possibility. Kofi and his followers had shown enslaved people across America that coordination was possible, that strategic thinking could overcome apparent powerlessness, that systems of oppression could be dismantled by people who understood them better than their oppressors did. The linguistic revolution spread through slave quarters like wildfire, disguised as cultural preservation. Work songs acquired new layers of meaning. Religious gatherings became tactical coordination meetings. Children's games taught survival skills and coded communication. What white authorities dismissed as African cultural traditions were actually sophisticated resistance training programs. Maria's discovery included correspondence between plantation owners across multiple states, documenting the spread of linguistic abnormalities that suggested extensive communication networks. By 1800, similar coded languages had appeared in South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina, and Maryland. The Kofi Rebellion had inspired a continental transformation that challenged slavery itself. The most remarkable document in the collection was a letter dated 1837, 44 years after the original rebellion. Written in the same symbolic script that Kofi's followers had used, it described an underground network that helped coordinate the Underground Railroad, slave rebellions, and even early abolition movements. The mysterious language had evolved into the foundation for organized resistance that that would eventually contribute to slavery's destruction. Languages never truly die. The economic impact had proven devastating to Virginia's plantation system. Insurance companies demanded higher premiums for slave property. Potential buyers avoided regions with histories of coordinated resistance. Some plantation owners simply abandoned their holdings rather than risk similar uprisings. The rebellion had succeeded in ways Kofi might never have anticipated, not just in liberating 43 people, but in making slavery economically unsustainable in areas where enslaved people demonstrated organizational capabilities. But the human cost had been enormous. The new laws passed in response to the rebellion had made life more brutal for enslaved people across the South. Literacy became a capital crime. Assembly restrictions separated families. Surveillance increased until privacy became impossible. The price of resistance was measured in generations of increased oppression. Yet the resistance continued evolving. Morton's journal described coded languages that had become more sophisticated over decades, communication systems that allowed coordination across vast distances, and organizational structures that suggested enslaved people had never truly accepted their bondage. They'd simply been waiting for the right moment to reveal their capabilities. The Great Dismal Swamp had indeed become sanctuary for communities of escaped slaves. Archaeological evidence from the 20th century confirmed settlements that persisted for decades, complete with agricultural systems, governing structures, and defensive capabilities that demonstrated sophisticated planning. Some of these communities survived until the Civil War, when their residents emerged to fight for the Union Army with military knowledge that impressed professional soldiers. Maria's research revealed that descendants of the original rebellion had played significant roles in later resistance movements. Children who'd learned Kofi's coded language became leaders in the Underground Railroad. Adults who'd escaped during the original uprising established schools for freed slaves after the Civil War. The rebellion's influence had rippled through generations, contributing to the eventual destruction of the system it had first challenged. The most profound discovery came in Morton's final entries, written shortly before his death in 1821. He'd continued studying coded languages among enslaved populations and had reached a conclusion that shook his fundamental beliefs about race and intelligence. The sophisticated communication systems, the strategic thinking, the organizational capabilities, all evidence that challenged every scientific and religious justification for human bondage. "I have spent my career studying language," he wrote, "and I can state with certainty that the intellectual capabilities demonstrated by these enslaved populations exceed those of many educated whites. We have built our society on a lie, and that lie is destroying us from within." The journal ended with Morton's prediction that slavery would eventually collapse under the weight of its own contradictions, brought down by people who'd never truly been conquered, only strategically patient. What happens when a story buried for centuries finally surfaces to challenge everything we thought we knew about resistance, intelligence, and the true nature of human bondage? The answer lay waiting in archives across the South, where similar documents had been hidden by people who understood that some truths were too dangerous to destroy, but too important to reveal until the right moment arrived to let them speak. Today, some say that if you listen carefully in the Great Dismal Swamp on humid August nights, you can still hear voices speaking in tongues that sound like wind through unfamiliar trees, carrying words that mean freedom in every language. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.